Thanks, Chair. I'll maybe make a few general points on the section and then more specific points with the amendments as they come back. But first, I suppose this is the last time we'll have the Minister as the Minister for Transport, I believe, which I find... Well, I would be sorry in that regard because, in fairness, while I may not agree with any or hardly any of his policies, I have to say the way in which he conducts himself and the competence of that department and his handling of it has been actually very impressive. And from that point of view, I would be very sorry to see you lose that brief. But there you are. No. Anyway, onwards to higher and better things, no doubt, I think is ahead of you. But anyway, no, look, in terms of this issue, it has been hugely important and a stressful piece of legislation for a lot of airport workers because we have to see it in the context of the other issues and the backdrop to this, the uncertainty and the vulnerability of people in facing their retirement years because of the mess that is the IAS airline scheme and aviation scheme. We do disagree on the roots of that, but I think it is important to put some of these issues on the record again, because if we're talking about a solution potentially, or it's supposed to be a solution which affects people in their retirement, well then we have to identify the problem first in order to see are we dealing with it properly. And to me, we're looking at this the wrong way around. We appreciate, and many of the pensioners appreciate, the fact that the Minister amended at committee stage the provision which gave the trustees the power to make decisions without the consent of the members in that regard. And it is a little bit of a relief that that's gone, but we still feel it's very, very necessary to remove this section in its entirety in relation to where it makes reference and impacts on the IAS itself. And just to briefly recap on some of the reasons for that. There is a problem with funding in the scheme, but again I have to put it on the record that the overwhelming responsibility for that situation rests with the employers and their inability to adequately fund this scheme over the years, and other managerial decisions which they took which impacted and put a strain on this scheme. And yet the people who are being asked to pay the price of that are the pensioners and the existing workers in those companies. And the reason why, it's not just me saying that, there's a lot of other supporting evidence to back that situation up, not least the judgment of Justice Murphy in July 2012 in the High Court, when he deemed that the IAS pension scheme was a contingent creditor in terms of Aer Lingus, when Aer Lingus, for example, tried to move some monies. And that is a court ruling which basically says that Aer Lingus owe the IAS scheme 500 million in a contingent liability of 475 million. That is just the Aer Lingus bit, but we know that they're not delivering that, they're delivering a much smaller amount to that. But not only, and I think I'd like the Minister to comment on this because I don't think it's been brought out, neither of the companies are putting money into the IAS scheme, neither of them. So that is getting no money from anybody except the existing pensioners who've already retired. They're the only ones who are putting cash into the IAS scheme, and they're doing that by experiencing cuts in their benefits, money which is being saved to the scheme. The employers are not putting money into the scheme. They're putting money aside into a separate contingency fund to benefit the deferred members and the active members in the event of future problems. So it's going into a separate fund at the side, not into the IAS scheme itself. And again, it's ring-fenced for the deferreds and for the actives, and nothing for the pensioners who have already retired. And I think we should look at them, because many of those people are the people who for 40 years plus contributed to a pension scheme where they were given a certain, what we call a reasonable expectation that they would have a certain standard of living when they retired. The scheme was set by the actuary. These people paid increases in their contributions about 7 times during their working life, but while they were doing that, the employers reduced their contributions about 3 times during that period. And yet it's the pensioners now in the cuts that are being proposed who are taking a cut of about 40 euros a week, and will be taking another cut of 40 euros a week in the new year. But there's no fund to mitigate the losses for them, because, as I said, the deficit the money is not being put into the scheme, it's being put into a separate scheme at the side. Yet these people did pay for their full uncoordinated pension. Now, a number of issues came up at committee. Just one point before I go on to the points you made at committee. So the employer is liable. He's been deemed liable by the courts to fund that scheme. The workforce had no choice in this. It was a contract of your employment that you had to be a member of this scheme. And what is a bitter irony for a lot of people, it was a condition of employment for those of us in Ireland and in the UK. But the ones who work for the Irish national carrier in the UK are going to get all their benefits ring-fenced and secured. The commitment made to them will be honoured because of the way in which pensions are dealt with in Britain. But the Irish workers in the Irish airline won't get that and are facing an unsecure future. So that's kind of really galling for people because of the contributions they made, because they had no choice. It was a condition of their employment and so on. And on top of that, you have the insult that this amendment proposes to give the trustees even extra powers. And we have to, again, put it on the record that one of the key reasons why there's a problem of funding, which the pensioners, deferreds and actives are being asked to pay for, is because of appalling investment decisions by the trustees. Now, I know the Minister at committee said he wasn't really interested in looking at that it wasn't his brief, it was a matter for the Department of Social Protection and so on. But I think that is an area that absolutely needs a critical examination, because you had some very ill-judged and ill-timed and, I suppose, putting it mildly, peculiar decisions being made by the trustees, where you had 1.4 billion in assets being sold off as part of a freeze and de-risk strategy at a time when property portfolios were increasing. And we made the point before, they gave away essentially a prime site across the road on Molesworth Street and so on, which within a 10-month period had grown in value by a further 10 million, which had a annual rental on those properties 6.5 million. You could not get that portfolio anywhere in Dublin today, and yet the IAS scheme was able to divest itself of that for very, very little in return. And who's paying the price of that? It's obviously the pensioners who are there. They invested that money, what they got from the sale of the assets, in and tied it up in an Irish Life fixed income fund, hundreds of millions, with very, very low yield returns on that, and then invested the rest in sovereign bonds, which again have a very low return. And there are, Minister, a lot of questions to be answered in this regard. And if the Department of Transport isn't interested, then I do think the Department of Social Protection should be, because we have agents such as Jones, Lang and LaSalle, who were the property advisors to the IASS pension scheme. They were also the selling agents of that property, and yet they were the valuation agents for the people who bought it, IPUT. They also were people who are located in the proposed office redevelopment in one of those buildings, so they have a vested interest in that. The monies that were taken from the sale of those properties was used to invest in Irish Life. Okay, and then we suddenly find out, well, you know, Irish Life were the, coincidentally, investment advisors to the IASS. One of the trustees was a former long-standing employee of Irish Life. And this pension scheme in the airport have invested over half their funds, tied it up in Irish Life. I mean, there's a lot of things to be answered here. It was reported as well last year that the investment advisors, i.e. Irish Life, were getting 25,000 of pensioners' funds in management fees on a weekly basis for their advice, which ended up with, you know, airport workers' money being put in there. So there are a huge amount of questions which need to be answered, and I think we have to register that, and that absolutely has to be looked at going forward, because that, to me, is a big reason why there is a strain and a problem on the pension scheme. And by us including provisions in this legislation linked to that, I think is very, very risky situation. Now, I made the point about the pensioners, but I just wanted to briefly refer to the deferred members as well, who in fairness throughout this process felt that they hadn't got a voice. Although fair play to them, they very much mobilised themselves and ended up giving themselves a voice out of necessity, which I suppose is a good thing as part of that. The pot that's been put at the side for them has been marginally increased, which again is welcome, but it doesn't solve the problem that they face either. And as Deputy Ellis said, people believe that, you know, long-standing members of the scheme are still losing 50 to 60% of their expected pension based on this, and that's based on the fact that they will lose the uncoordination situation, which represents about 1/3 of their expected benefits. Now, the average IASS pension was about 30,000, I think, in that regard. So there are big implications on people's living standards, but we have to put the responsibility where it is here. In 2001, Aer Lingus employed 6,833 people. 10 years later, they employed half that number. 3,491 people were employed 10 years later. So they basically halved the workforce. Now, that comes at a cost, and they didn't calculate that cost. But who gained from that? Well, in the case of Aer Lingus did. It's had a very healthy and buoyant cash reserves financial position over the past period because they reduced their wage bill. And if you like, they put the cost of that now onto the pension scheme, because one of the reasons why people were incentivised out of that company to give up their secure, permanent, pensionable jobs was the fact that they were going to get an uncoordinated pension, and that, if you like, that was an enticement to get them out. The companies benefited from that by their payroll savings being reduced, and yet they are the ones paying the price. Now, I do know that a lot of the deferred members were very upset, Minister, at the comments that you made at second stage, when you talked about the fact that these workers you acknowledged that they were encouraged to retire and take early retirement, but you pointed out that they were in receipt of generous exit packages, as you called them, negotiated with their trade unions and so on, and that these should be taken into account. Now, workers feel they absolutely shouldn't, and I agree with that, because a severance payment really is resulting the managerial decisions in the company at that time. It's absolutely irrelevant in relation to a person's prospective pension in the future. And if you like, it's kind of introducing a sort of a means testing, which is very disingenuous, because the point is this was an entitlement to these workers based on their contract of employment, and to include it in that way really isn't on, I think, and we have to reflect that.